The rain had started 3 hours before dawn, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud that swallowed my worn boots with each step. I could smell it, the peculiar scent of earth giving way to water, mixed with the acrid smoke from chimneys that never seemed to warm the houses in our village. My fingers were numb, clutched around the thin shawl that did little against the cold seeping through my bones. November in Greystone was unforgiving, especially to those of us who lived on its edges, barely visible to the pack that thrived in its center. I was an Omega. The word itself felt like a brand burned into my skin, a label that explained everything and nothing at once, in a world where strength meant survival, where alphas commanded and betas followed. Omegas like me existed in the margins, rare, undervalued, dismissed. My pale blonde hair, which my mother once said looked like moonlight, was now just another thing that made me stand out in the worst possible way. Too soft, too different, too other. The marketplace was already stirring when I arrived, vendors setting up their stalls with practiced efficiency. I kept my head down, weaving between bodies that barely registered my presence. Invisibility was a skill I'd perfected over 23 years. The baker's wife didn't meet my eyes when I bought half a loaf of yesterday's bread. The butcher looked through me as if I were made of glass. Even the children playing in the square seemed to instinctively move around me, like water around a stone. My destination was the herb seller's stall at the far corner, where Mrs. Hadley sold remedies for ailments the pack doctor wouldn't bother treating in people like me. The coins in my pocket felt heavier than they should. 12 copper pieces, everything I had left after paying rent on the tiny cottage I shared with my elderly neighbor, Mr. Chen. He'd been kind to me when others weren't, a retired beta who'd lost his family to fever years ago and never quite recovered. We looked after each other in the quiet way that outcasts do. "Just the lavender oil today," I told Mrs. Hadley. My voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her weathered hands wrapping the small bottle with more care than necessary. She'd always been gentler with me than most. Perhaps because she remembered my mother, who'd died bringing me into this world. Another Omega, another tragedy the pack preferred to forget. As I turned to leave, I nearly collided with someone. My heart seized. Physical contact was dangerous for Omegas, especially during the week before the full moon when instincts ran high. But the man who steadied me with a gentle hand on my elbow wasn't from our pack. I could tell immediately. His scent was unfamiliar, carrying notes of pine and something wilder, untamed. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that held a depth of sadness I recognized intimately. "I'm sorry," I stammered, stepping back quickly. "I didn't see my... No harm done, child." His voice was rough, but not unkind. He swayed slightly, and I noticed the pallor of his skin, the way his hand pressed against his ribs as if holding something together, injured, and alone. Strangers didn't just wander into Greystone, especially not ones who looked like they'd barely escaped something terrible. He moved past me toward Mrs. Hadley's stall, but I heard her sharp intake of breath. "I don't serve rogues," she said, her earlier kindness evaporating. "Move along before someone calls the patrol." Rogues. Wolves without packs, without protection. They were considered dangerous, unstable, though I'd always wondered if that was true, or just another story the powerful told to keep their borders clear. The man didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply nodded and turned away, his movements careful, pained. I should have walked away. Every survival instinct I'd honed screamed at me to disappear into the crowd, to protect the small, fragile existence I'd managed to carve out. But something in his eyes, that bone-deep weariness, called to something equally weary in me. My mother's voice echoed in my memory. Not a lesson about jewelry or symbols, but something simpler, harder to hold on to. When you have nothing, compassion costs you everything, but it's the only thing that makes us more than our circumstances. Before I could second-guess myself, I followed him. He'd stopped at the edge of the market, leaning against a post, and I could see now that his shirt was torn, darkened with something I tried not to identify. The rain had started again, light but persistent. "Excuse me," I called softly. He turned, surprised. I pulled the coins from my pocket, all 12 of them, and held them out. "There's a healer 2 streets down, Mrs. Patterson. She's..." She's not particular about who she helps. This should be enough for basic supplies." He stared at the coins, then at me, and something shifted in his expression. "That's all you have." It wasn't a question. "I'll manage." The lie came easily. I had no idea how I'd manage, but that seemed less important than the fact that he was hurt and alone, and everyone else had already decided he didn't deserve help. Why? The question held genuine confusion, as if kindness were a language he'd forgotten. I didn't have a good answer, because someone should. For a long moment, he simply looked at me, and I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with vulnerability, and everything to do with being truly seen. Finally, he took the coins, his fingers carefully avoiding touching mine. "What's your name?" "Elena," I whispered. "Elena." He repeated it like he was committing it to memory. "Thank you. More than you know." Then he was gone, disappearing into the rain-soaked streets, and I was left standing there with empty pockets and a strange flutter in my chest that felt dangerously close to hope. The walk home was longer without the weight of those coins, as if gravity itself had changed. Mr. Chen was dozing in his chair when I arrived, and I moved quietly through the cottage, trying not to wake him. I'd figure out the rent later. I'd done it before, taking odd jobs that paid in scraps, mending clothes for pack members who wouldn't acknowledge me in daylight. That night, I dreamed of silver eyes and pine forests, of running without fear through trees that welcomed rather than threatened. I woke to darkness and the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was the wind. Our cottage sat at the very edge of pack territory, where the forest began its slow reclamation of land. But the sound came again, deliberate, circling. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept to the window, pulling back the thin curtain just enough to see. 5 wolves stood in a semicircle around the cottage, their forms massive and dark against the pre-dawn gray. But it was their eyes that stopped my breath, all of them gleaming with an intelligence that was distinctly human. These weren't wild animals, these were shifters, and from the coordinated way they moved, they were pack. But not our pack. I knew every wolf in Greystone by sight, if not by name. These were strangers, and the one in the center, the largest, with fur so black it seemed to absorb light, had eyes that gleamed amber gold even in the darkness. They weren't attacking. They were waiting, watching. The largest one's gaze found mine through the window, and I felt the impact of it like a physical touch. Recognition flickered in those inhuman eyes, and impossibly, I thought I saw the same thing I'd glimpsed in the stranger's face yesterday. That's when I understood. The man I'd helped hadn't been alone after all. And now his pack had come looking for the Omega, who'd given their wounded member his last coins. The question was, had they come to thank me, or to eliminate a witness to their presence in enemy territory? The wolves didn't move, neither did I. We existed in a moment suspended between heartbeats, between choices that could end in violence or something I couldn't yet name. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Greystone's alpha, Tobias Crane, had made his position on rogues abundantly clear. They were to be reported immediately and driven out. Or worse, if anyone discovered I'd helped one, if they knew these wolves were here because of me. Mr. Chen stirred in the next room, and the sound shattered my paralysis. I couldn't let him be caught in whatever this was. Moving as quietly as I could, I grabbed my coat and slipped out the back door, my bare feet silent against the cold wooden steps. The rain had stopped, leaving everything drenched and glistening under the pale light of the dying moon. I didn't have a plan beyond leading them away from the cottage, away from the one person in this world who'd shown me consistent kindness. The forest loomed ahead, dark and dense with pine trees that blocked out most of the sky. I'd played here as a child, knew its paths and hiding spots, though I hadn't ventured deep in years. The pack's warnings about what lurked in the woods had been thorough and terrifying. Behind me, I heard the soft padding of paws against wet earth. They were following, silent as shadows. My breath came in short gasps, fear and cold making my lungs burn. I pushed deeper into the trees, branches catching at my hair and coat. A root snagged my foot and I stumbled, catching myself against rough bark that scraped my palms. When I looked back, all 5 wolves had stopped at the tree line, forming that same deliberate semicircle. The largest one, the black wolf with golden eyes, stepped forward, and before my disbelieving gaze, he began to shift. I'd seen transformations before, but never this close, never this intimate. Bones reformed with sounds like breaking ice, fur receding into skin, until a man stood where the wolf had been. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders, and a face that would have been beautiful, if not for the hardness carved into it by violence and loss. Scars traced across his chest and arms, silver against tan skin, and his eyes, those amber gold eyes, held an intensity that made me want to flee and stay in equal measure. "Don't run." His voice was deep, commanding but not cruel. "We mean you no harm, Elena." Hearing my name from his lips sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with cold. "How do you know?" I started, then remembered. "The stranger, the coins." "He told you." "Elias is my second. You saved his life yesterday." He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed against the tree. He stopped immediately, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "The wound was poisoned, silver, tipped with wolfsbane. Without treatment, he would have died within hours. The supplies you helped him buy, they bought him time until we could reach him." The other 4 wolves had shifted too, revealing 3 men and 1 woman, all watching our exchange with expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness. They were dressed now, having apparently stashed clothes at the forest's edge, a practiced efficiency that spoke of years operating on the margins. "I don't understand," I managed, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The leader's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You gave everything you had to a stranger who could offer you nothing in return. In a world where Omegas are treated as disposable, you chose compassion over survival. That is, rare." Something about the way he said it, the weight behind the words, suggested he knew exactly what it meant to be considered disposable. I studied him more carefully, noting how the others positioned themselves, protective but deferential. This was an alpha, that much was certain, but not like Tobias Crane, who ruled through intimidation and violence. This man carried his authority differently, like a burden he'd accepted rather than a prize he'd won. "Who are you?" I whispered. "My name is Demon Ashford. We're from the Northwood Territory, 3 days' run from here." He glanced back at his pack, some silent communication passing between them. "We've been tracking the ones who poisoned Elias. They're part of a larger organization that hunts wolves. Any wolves, rogue or pack. They've been moving south, getting bolder. We believe they're planning something in Greystone." Horror crawled up my spine. Hunters. I'd heard rumors, dismissed them as stories meant to keep young wolves from straying too far from pack protection. "You need to tell Alpha Crane. Crane knows." The bitterness in Demon's voice was palpable. "We sent word 3 weeks ago. He refused to meet with us, called us northern savages, and said if we set foot in his territory, we'd be treated as the threat." That sounded exactly like something Tobias would do. He was so obsessed with maintaining his image of strength and control that he'd rather ignore a real danger than admit he might need help from outsiders. "Then why are you here? Why risk coming anyway?" Demon's gaze held mine, and I saw something flicker in those golden depths. Determination, maybe, or the kind of stubborn hope that refused to die even when it should. "Because people will die if we don't. Because the right thing doesn't stop being right, just because it's dangerous." He paused. "Because someone recently reminded one of my pack that compassion matters, even when it costs everything." The words hit me like a physical blow. My own philosophy reflected back at me by a stranger who somehow understood the weight of it. The woman in his pack, tall, with copper hair and sharp green eyes, stepped forward. "I'm Sienna, Demon's third." She looked at me with an assessment that was thorough, but not unkind. "We need information about Greystone's patrol patterns, about where Crane keeps his vulnerable pack members. If the hunters strike, they'll target the weakest first. Omegas, elderly, children, Mr. Chen, the orphans in the church shelter, Mrs. Hadley with her arthritic joints and failing eyesight." My mind immediately catalogued all the people who would be defenseless, People the pack tolerated but wouldn't prioritize protecting. I don't have access to patrol schedules, I said slowly. I'm barely acknowledged. I'm not even allowed at pack meetings, but you know the territory, Demon said. You know where people actually live, not just where the strong ones display their power. That's what we need. The real Greystone, not the version Crane wants outsiders to see. I should have said no. Every survival instinct, every lesson learned through years of being invisible and vulnerable, screamed at me to walk away. Helping them would be treason. If Tobias discovered I'd collaborated with rogues, because that's what he'd call them, regardless of their actual status, I'd be exiled or worse. But looking at these 5 wolves, at the determination and desperate hope in their eyes, I saw myself reflected back in ways that had nothing to do with weakness. They were fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. They were risking everything for strangers who'd already rejected them. Just like I'd given my last coins to a wounded man who owed me nothing. There's a cavern, I heard myself say, about 2 miles deeper into the forest, near the old silver mine. It's abandoned, but it's dry and hidden. You could use it as a base. I looked at Demon, making a choice that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. I'll help you, but I need your word that you'll protect the vulnerable ones first. Not just the pack's warriors. Something fierce and approving flashed in Demon's eyes. You have my word. And more than that. He glanced back at his pack, then returned his attention to me with an intensity that made my breath catch. You have my protection. For as long as you need it, Elena. You're under Northwood's shield. The formal declaration hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I didn't fully understand but felt bone deep. In the shifter world, protection offered by an alpha wasn't just words. It was a binding promise, a claim that would make others think twice before threatening me. It was also, I realized with a jolt, the first time anyone had ever promised to protect me rather than just tolerate my existence. Thank you, I whispered, the words inadequate for what I was feeling. Don't thank me yet. Demon's smile was slight but genuine. This is going to get dangerous. But I think you already knew that when you gave Elias those coins. He was right. Some part of me had known, even then, that helping him would change something fundamental. I just hadn't realized how much. As dawn began to break through the trees, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Demon's pack melted back into the forest with practiced ease. But Demon lingered, his gaze holding mine for a moment that stretched and deepened into something neither of us named. I'll return tonight, he said quietly. After dark, when your neighbor is asleep. We have much to plan. Then, so softly I almost missed it, you're braver than you know, little Omega. The endearment should have felt patronizing. Instead, it felt like recognition, like being seen not as lesser but as different in ways that mattered. I watched him shift and disappear into the shadows, my heart hammering with fear and something dangerously close to anticipation. When I returned to the cottage, Mr. Chen was awake, brewing tea with shaking hands. Thought I heard something outside, he said, his clouded eyes not quite focusing on me. Everything all right, child? Everything's fine. I lied, the words tasting bitter. Just a deer, I think. The rain probably drove it close to the houses. He nodded, accepting the explanation without question, and I felt the weight of my deception settle over me like a second skin. I was lying to the one person who'd been kind to me. I was collaborating with rogues against my own alpha. I was risking everything for people who might not even care if I disappeared. But I was also, for the first time in my life, choosing my own path rather than accepting the one chosen for me. That night, I waited by the window long after Mr. Chen had gone to bed. The moon was a thin crescent, offering little light, but I didn't need it. I felt Demon's approach before I saw him, some new awareness humming beneath my skin. When he emerged from the tree line, already in human form, my traitorous heart skipped a beat. This was madness. This was dangerous. This was probably going to get me killed. But as I opened the door and met those amber gold eyes, I realized something that should have terrified me, but instead felt like the first true thing I'd known in years. I didn't want to stop. Whatever this was, whatever was beginning in the space between a rejected Omega and an Alpha who protected rather than conquered, I wanted to see where it led. even if it burned us both. Demon moved through my small cottage like smoke, silent and careful not to disturb anything. In the confined space, his presence felt overwhelming, not threatening, but intense in a way that made me hyper-aware of every breath, every small movement. He'd brought a rolled map, which he spread across my worn kitchen table with practiced efficiency. "This is Greystone as we understand it," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid waking Mr. Chen. His finger traced the boundaries marked in faded ink. "But maps only show what people want seen. Tell me what's missing." I leaned over the table, studying the familiar territory rendered unfamiliar by formal cartography. "Here." I pointed to an unmarked area near the eastern border. "There's a settlement of elderly wolves who can't shift anymore. 20, maybe 25 of them. The pack provides minimal support, but mostly they're forgotten." My finger moved north. "And here, the church shelter where orphans and widows live. 50 people, give or take. Most are omegas or weak betas." Demon's jaw tightened as I spoke, his expression darkening with each location I revealed. "Crane just abandons them?" "Not abandons. Ignores." I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the fire burning in the small hearth. "He focuses on the strong, the ones who can fight and hunt and produce powerful offspring. The rest of us are inconvenient reminders that not everyone is born to dominate. That's not how a pack should function." The anger in Demon's voice was controlled but unmistakable. "An alpha's first duty is to protect the vulnerable, not showcase the powerful." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something that made my chest ache. He believed what he was saying. It wasn't rhetoric or performance. This man actually thought protecting the weak mattered more than projecting strength. In all my years in Greystone, I'd never encountered an alpha who thought that way. "How did you become alpha?" The question escaped before I could stop it. "If you don't mind me asking." Demon's expression shifted, something old and painful moving behind his eyes. He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he sighed and sank into one of my rickety chairs, suddenly looking exhausted. "I didn't want it. The title, the responsibility, none of it." His hands curled into fists on the table. "My father was alpha before me, strong, respected, everything an alpha should be. He had 2 sons. My older brother, Matthias, was supposed to inherit. I was content to be second, to support him." The past tense hung heavy in the air. I sat down across from him, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. "Hunters came to Northwood 5 years ago. Different group than the ones here now, but same hatred, same tactics. They attacked during the harvest festival when everyone was gathered. Vulnerable." His voice had gone flat, emotionless in the way of someone recounting trauma they'd relived too many times. "They had silver bullets, wolfsbane gas, traps designed specifically to kill shifters. My father died protecting the children in the main hall. Matthias died holding the northern gate so families could escape through the southern route." "Demon." I breathed, my hand reaching across the table before I could think better of it. He stared at my fingers hovering near his, then slowly, carefully, turned his palm up in invitation. When I placed my hand in his, the contact sent electricity racing up my arm, but neither of us pulled away. 73 people died that night," he continued, his thumb moving absently against my palm in small, soothing circles that I suspected were as much for his comfort as mine. "We killed the hunters eventually, drove them out. But the damage was done. The pack needed an alpha, and I was all that was left of my father's bloodline. So I became what they needed, even though I knew I could never fill the void my father and brother left behind." Understanding crashed over me. This was why he was here, why he'd risked coming to Greystone despite Tobias's threats. He'd failed to protect his own people once, and he was determined never to let it happen again, even if it meant protecting strangers who'd rejected his help. "You're nothing like the alphas I've known," I said softly. "They take power because they want it, because it makes them feel important. You carry it like a weight you can't put down." His eyes met mine, and in them I saw recognition. The same thing I'd felt when he called me brave. We were both people shaped by loss, by being forced into roles we hadn't chosen, by carrying burdens that never got lighter. The difference was that his burden came with authority, while mine came with invisibility. "Tell me about you," Demon said, breaking the intensity of the moment. "How does an Omega with kindness in her bones end up alone in a cottage at the edge of the world?" I should have deflected, should have kept my own wounds hidden, but his honesty deserved honesty in return. "My mother died in childbirth. Omega pregnancies are complicated, dangerous. She knew the risks but chose to have me anyway." I stared at our joined hands, finding courage in the connection. "My father was a beta from a good family. When my mother died, he had a choice: raise me or pretend I didn't exist. He chose the latter. Signed over guardianship to the pack and never spoke to me again. I grew up in the church shelter, the place I showed you on the map, Elena. When I turned 18, they told me I had to leave, make room for younger children. Mr. Chen offered me the spare room in his cottage. He'd lost his daughter years before, said I reminded him of her. A bitter smile crossed my lips. I've been here 5 years now, working odd jobs, trying to be invisible enough that no one bothers to drive me out completely. Demon's hand tightened on mine, not painfully but firmly, grounding. "You shouldn't have to live like that. No one should." But I do. We all do. The elderly, the orphans, the weak. This is what packs become when strength is the only value that matters. I looked up at him, feeling brave and reckless, and tired of being small. "That's why I'll help you. Not just because it's right, but because I'm tired of pretending this is acceptable." Something blazed to life in Demon's eyes. Pride, maybe, or approval, or something deeper that neither of us was ready to name. Then we worked together. "You know Greystone's vulnerable population. I know how hunters think, how they operate. Between us, maybe we can prevent another massacre." We spent the next 2 hours mapping out locations, patrol patterns I'd observed, places where the pack's attention was thin. Demon shared what they'd learned about the hunters, a group called the Silver Covenant, fanatics who believed shifters were abominations that needed to be eradicated. They'd been moving methodically through smaller territories, testing defenses before hitting larger packs. "They'll strike during the full moon," Demon explained, his finger tracing a pattern on the map. "When most of the pack's warriors are out running, dealing with moon fever. That's when the vulnerable are most exposed." "That's 3 days away," I said, dread pooling in my stomach. "Which is why we need to move fast. Sienna and the others are scouting the southern border, looking for signs of the hunters' camp. Once we find them, we can plan a preemptive strike. You're going to attack them? Just the 5 of you?" Demon's smile was sharp, dangerous. "We're not going to kill them all, just enough to make them think twice. Destroy their weapons caches, scatter their forces, buy time to evacuate Greystone's vulnerable to safety." It was ambitious, possibly suicidal, but it was also the only plan that prioritized protecting the weak over maintaining some alpha's pride. "What do you need from me?" "Information, primarily, but also..." He hesitated, and I saw vulnerability flash across his features. "I need you to trust me. What we're doing, the risks we're taking. I need to know you believe I won't abandon you if things go wrong." The request was more intimate than it should have been, asking for faith I'd never been able to give anyone. But looking at this alpha who'd lost everything and still chose compassion, who'd crossed into enemy territory to protect strangers, I found I wanted to trust him desperately. "I believe you," I whispered, and meant it. The moment stretched between us, heavy with possibility, until a noise from Mr. Chen's room shattered it. Demon was on his feet instantly. The map rolled and tucked away with supernatural speed. "I should go. Can you meet me tomorrow night? Same time?" I nodded, walking him to the door. Before he left, he turned back, his hand coming up to cup my cheek in a gesture so gentle it made my throat tight. "You're not alone anymore, Elena, whatever happens. Remember that." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness, and I was left touching the place where his hand had been, my heart hammering with fear and hope, and something I was terrified to name. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. I went through my usual routine, visiting the market, taking mending work from Mrs. Patterson, checking on Mr. Chen. But my mind was elsewhere, cataloging vulnerabilities and imagining violence. Every stranger on the street became a potential hunter. Every shadow held threat. It was late afternoon when I noticed the black car parked near the pack house, sleek and expensive, and distinctly out of place in our rural village. Visitors weren't uncommon, but something about this one made my skin crawl. I watched from a distance as 3 men emerged, all dressed in dark suits that screamed money and purpose. They were human. I could tell by the way they moved, without the fluid grace of shifters. But there was something predatory about them nonetheless. Tobias Crane emerged from the pack house to greet them, his posture obsequious in a way I'd never seen. He was afraid of these men, I realized, or beholden to them. They spoke for several minutes, too far away for me to hear, but I caught Tobias gesturing toward the forest, toward the edges of his territory, toward the places where the vulnerable lived. Ice formed in my veins. These weren't just visitors. These were hunters, and Tobias was talking to them, helping them. I needed to find Demon. Now. I ran, propriety and invisibility forgotten in the face of urgency. The forest welcomed me like an old friend, and I pushed deeper, calling out in a voice I'd kept quiet for too long. Demon, Sienna, anyone from Northwood, I need help. A rustle to my left, and suddenly Sienna was there, concern etched on her sharp features. Elena, what's wrong? The hunters. I gasped, breathless from running and fear. They're at the pack house. Tobias is talking to them. I think... My voice broke. I think he's helping them. Sienna's face went hard as stone. Show me. We moved through the forest with Sienna leading, her movements fluid and silent in a way I could never hope to match. She'd sent up some kind of signal, a specific bird call that sounded natural but clearly wasn't. And within minutes, the rest of Demon's pack had converged on our position. Demon arrived last, his expression darkening when he saw my distressed state. Elena, what happened? I explained quickly, words tumbling over each other in my haste. The black car, the suited men, Tobias's deference and fear. Demon's jaw clenched tighter with each detail, and when I finished, the air around him seemed to crackle with barely contained fury. He's selling them information, Demon said, his voice dangerously quiet. Probably has been for weeks. That's why he refused to meet with us, why he called us savages. He didn't want us interfering with whatever deal he's made. But why? I couldn't comprehend it. These are his people. Why would he help hunters target them? It was Elias who answered, his voice rough but steady. He looked much better than when I'd seen him in the market. The color returned to his face, those silver scars now traced across his neck. Money, power, protection for his inner circle while sacrificing the ones he considers expendable. He met my eyes with understanding that cut deep. Men like Crane don't see Omegas and elderly as pack members. They see liabilities that cost resources without providing strength. The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. I'd known Tobias was harsh, had known he valued power over compassion. But to actively betray vulnerable pack members to hunters? It was monstrous in a way that transcended even his usual callousness. We need proof, Sienna said, ever practical. We can't just accuse an alpha of treason without evidence. The council would never believe outsiders over an established pack leader. Then we get proof. Demon's eyes found mine, intense and searching. Elena, how close can you get to the pack house without being noticed? My heart stuttered. I clean there sometimes. Tuesday and Friday mornings. No one really pays attention to me when I'm working. Tomorrow's Friday. Demon moved closer, his hand coming to rest on my shoulder. A gesture of comfort, and something more, a claiming that sent warmth flooding through my chest. I know I'm asking a lot, asking you to risk yourself like this. But if we can find documents, communications, anything that proves Crane is working with the hunters, we can take it to the regional council, Sienna finished. Force an investigation. Save the people he's planning to sacrifice. The risk was enormous. If Tobias caught me snooping, caught me working with rogues, I'd be lucky if exile was my worst punishment. But I thought of the children in the church shelter, of Mr. Chen sleeping peacefully while betrayal circled closer, of all the invisible people who'd been discarded by a system that only valued strength. I'll do it, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, but I'll need a way to contact you if something goes wrong. I can't just run into the forest shouting. Demon reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver whistle on a leather cord. This is keyed to a frequency only shifters can hear. 1 blast if you find something. 2 if you're in danger. We'll be close enough to reach you within minutes. I took the whistle, the metal warm from his body heat, and slipped it around my neck. It settled against my sternum like a promise, a talisman of protection I'd never had before. What about the evacuation plan? If Tobias is helping them, the full moon attack could come sooner. We start moving people tonight, Demon decided, quietly. Elena, you said there's an old community center near the church shelter? I nodded. It hasn't been used in years, but it's structurally sound. Stone walls, defensible. Perfect. Sienna, take Marcus and begin moving the elderly and children there. Tell them... He paused, thinking. Tell them it's a community gathering. Don't mention hunters or danger. We don't want to cause panic. Just get them somewhere we can protect them. Sienna nodded, already moving. Marcus, a quiet beta with kind eyes, followed her without question. That left Demon, Elias, and a younger man named Garrett, who'd been silent throughout the discussion, but watched everything with sharp intelligence. Garrett and I will scout the perimeter. Look for signs of where the hunters are staging, Demon continued. Elias, you're still recovering. I'm fine, Elias interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. And I'm not sitting out while the woman who saved my life walks into danger. Something passed between the two men, a conversation conducted entirely in looks and slight movements. Finally, Demon nodded. You'll stay in the forest near the pack house. If Elena signals danger, you get to her first. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary. We can't afford to reveal our presence yet. The plan settled over us like armor, each person knowing their role. But as the others dispersed, Demon caught my wrist gently, holding me back. In the dappled forest light, his eyes were more gold than amber, intense with concern and something deeper. I need you to promise me something, he said quietly. If it becomes too dangerous, if you think for even a moment that Crane suspects you, you run. You use that whistle and you run, and damn the evidence. Nothing is worth your life, Elena. Nothing. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made my eyes sting. No one had ever spoken to me like that, as if my survival mattered more than the mission, more than the greater good. I promise, I whispered. But Demon, the same goes for you. Don't throw your life away trying to save people who've already rejected your help. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a caress that felt both tentative and inevitable. They haven't all rejected us. You didn't. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. That gives me hope that others might make the same choice, given the chance. I wanted to close the distance between us, wanted to lean into his touch and forget about hunters and betrayal and the 100 ways this could end in tragedy. But footsteps approached, Garrett, calling out that they needed to move, and the moment fractured like glass. Be careful, Demon said, his hand falling away. I'll be listening for that whistle. Then he was gone, melting into the forest with his packmate. And I was left alone with the weight of tomorrow's task pressing down on my shoulders. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed, listening to Mr. Chen's familiar snoring through the thin walls, and tried not to think about all the ways I could fail. The whistle hung around my neck, hidden beneath my nightgown, and I found myself clutching it like a lifeline. Somewhere in the darkness, I heard the mournful howl of a wolf. Demon, I thought, though I couldn't explain how I knew. The sound was beautiful and lonely, a call into the void that expected no answer. Without thinking, I went to the window and looked out at the sliver of moon, at the forest that hid so many secrets. And I howled back. It wasn't a proper howl. I couldn't shift, had never been able to despite my Omega designation. But I poured all my fear and determination and strange, fragile hope into that sound, sending it out into the night like a prayer. The forest went silent for a heartbeat, 2, and then Demon's howl came again. Different this time. Not lonely, but answered, acknowledged. We stayed like that for long minutes, calling and responding across the darkness, 2 broken people finding an unexpected harmony. When I finally returned to bed, I slept dreamlessly for the first time in months. Friday morning arrived too quickly and too slowly. I dressed in my plainest clothes, the ones I wore for cleaning work, and braided my pale hair back severely. The whistle stayed around my neck, hidden but present, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Mr. Chen was having a good day, his mind clear and sharp as I helped him with breakfast. "You seem different," he observed, watching me with those clouded eyes that somehow saw more than they should. Lighter, maybe. Or perhaps just less alone. I nearly dropped the teacup I was washing. "I don't know what you mean." "Child, I may be old and half-blind, but I'm not a fool." His smile was gentle, knowing. "Someone's been visiting you at night, someone who makes you stand a little straighter. Speak a little louder." He reached out and patted my hand. "I'm glad. You've been alone too long." Tears pricked my eyes. "It's complicated. And possibly dangerous. The best things usually are." He squeezed my hand. "Just promise me you'll be careful. And that whoever he is, he treats you like the gift you are." "He does," I whispered, the truth of it settling warm in my chest. "He really does." The walk to the pack house felt longer than usual. Each step weighted with anticipation and dread. The building loomed ahead, a sprawling structure that had been expanded over generations, more fortress than home. I entered through the servants' entrance as always, nodding to the beta who managed the cleaning staff. "You're doing the Alpha's office today," she said without looking up from her ledger. "He's in meetings all morning, wants it spotless by the time he returns." Perfect. Almost too perfect. I took my supplies and climbed the stairs to Tobias's private office, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway was empty, silent except for the distant murmur of voices from the council room below. I slipped inside the office and closed the door behind me. The room reeked of Tobias, sandalwood, and smoke, and the acrid scent of dominance asserted through fear. His desk was massive, carved oak that dominated the space. I set down my cleaning supplies and approached it with trembling hands, knowing I was crossing a line I could never uncross. The first drawer held nothing interesting. Correspondence about territory boundaries, complaints from pack members about minor disputes. The second drawer was locked, but the key hung on a hook behind a landscape painting, obvious once I thought about it. Tobias's arrogance made him careless. Inside the locked drawer, I found a folder marked Silver Covenant, Confidential. My breath caught as I opened it, scanning documents that detailed everything Demon had suspected and worse. Tobias hadn't just been sharing information with the hunters, he'd been actively planning the attack with them, marking locations of acceptable losses in exchange for the hunters leaving his inner circle untouched. The elderly settlement, the church shelter, even the scattered cottages like mine at the territory's edge, all marked for elimination, all traded away like they were nothing. My hands shook as I pulled the whistle from beneath my collar and blew once, the signal that I'd found evidence. Now I just needed to. The door opened behind me. I spun around, the folder clutched to my chest, and found myself face to face with Tobias Crane. His expression went from surprise to cold fury in the span of a heartbeat. "Well," he said, closing the door with deliberate care. "Isn't this interesting?" Time seemed to slow as Tobias stepped further into the room, his predatory gaze fixed on the folder in my hands. I'd seen him angry before, had witnessed his casual cruelty toward those he considered beneath him. But this was different. This was cold, calculated fury, from a man whose carefully constructed plans had been disrupted by the least likely person in his pack. "Put the folder down, Omega." His voice was deceptively soft, the kind of quiet that preceded violence. "And perhaps I'll make your death quick." My fingers tightened on the documents. Every instinct screamed at me to obey, to submit, to make myself small and hope he'd show mercy. 23 years of conditioning warred with 3 days of feeling like I mattered, like my choices had weight and consequence. I thought of Demon's hand on my face, of his fierce declaration that my life had value. I thought of Mr. Chen and the children in the shelter and all the people marked for death on these pages. And I chose defiance. No. The word came out stronger than I felt. My other hand found the whistle around my neck, and I blew twice, the danger signal, before Tobias could cross the room. He moved with alpha speed, slamming me against the wall hard enough to rattle my teeth. The folders scattered across the floor, papers fanning out like accusations. His hand wrapped around my throat, not quite choking but promising it. "You stupid, worthless little bitch. Did you really think you could—" The window exploded inward in a shower of glass and wood. Elias came through it in half-shifted form, something between human and wolf, all claws and fury and protective rage. He hit Tobias with enough force to send them both crashing into the desk, and suddenly the room was chaos. I scrambled for the documents, shoving them back into the folder with shaking hands as the two wolves fought. Tobias was stronger, but Elias fought with the desperate ferocity of someone protecting something precious. They were destroying the office, furniture splintering under the impact of bodies moving at superhuman speed. "Elena, run!" Elias shouted, blocking a strike that would have decapitated him. "Get those documents out of here." I ran. Down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off stone walls, the folder clutched against my chest like armor. Behind me, I heard shouts, more growls, Tobias's inner circle responding to the commotion. I took the servants' stairs, nearly falling twice in my haste, and burst out into the daylight just as black shapes poured from the forest. Demon and his pack, answering my call. He was magnificent and terrifying in wolf form, larger than the others, his black fur seeming to absorb light. But when those golden eyes found me, I saw relief and fear warring in their depths. He shifted mid-stride, reaching me in seconds, his hands immediately checking me for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did he—" "I'm fine. Elias is inside, he's—" My voice broke. "Tobias knows. About the documents. About you. Everything." Demon's expression hardened. He took the folder from my trembling hands and passed it to Sienna, who'd remained in human form. "Get this to the regional council. Don't stop, don't engage, just run." She nodded and disappeared into the forest, Marcus flanking her protectively. That left Demon, Garrett, and me standing in the open as pack members began pouring from the pack house. I recognized faces, betas I'd cleaned for, warriors who'd looked through me 1,000 times. Now they looked at me with hatred and disgust, seeing a traitor instead of an invisible ghost. "Elena!" Mr. Chen's voice cut through the tension. He stood in the doorway of our cottage, confusion and fear etched across his weathered face. "What's happening?" Before I could answer, Tobias emerged from the pack house, Elias's blood on his hands and murder in his eyes. "That Omega bitch has been conspiring with rogues," he announced, his voice carrying to every gathered pack member. "She's stolen confidential documents and endangered every one of you. The sentence for treason is death." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some angry, some uncertain. But no one stepped forward to defend me. Not one person I'd lived among for 23 years spoke up to question their alpha's judgment. Except one. "You're lying." Mr. Chen's voice was thin but steady, as he shuffled forward, leaning heavily on his cane. "Elena doesn't have a treacherous bone in her body. Whatever she did, she had good reason." "The old fool doesn't know what he's saying," Tobias dismissed. But I saw uncertainty flicker across some faces. Mr. Chen was respected, even in his diminished state, a reminder of what they'd all eventually become. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Mr. Chen reached me, placing himself between Tobias and me with a courage that made my throat tight. "This girl has been invisible to you for her entire life, has suffered your neglect and scorn without complaint. If she's turned against you, perhaps you should ask yourself why." Demon moved to stand beside me, his presence a wall of protection. "Your alpha has been working with the Silver Covenant," he announced, his voice carrying across the gathered pack. "He's been selling information about your vulnerable members in exchange for protection of his inner circle. The hunters are planning to attack during the full moon, and Tobias has marked the elderly, the children, and the Omegas for elimination." The accusations hung in the air, too terrible to immediately process. I saw disbelief on most faces, but also dawning horror on a few, those who'd perhaps noticed inconsistencies, who'd questioned Tobias's decisions but never dared voice their doubts. "Lies," Tobias snarled. "Why would you believe rogues over your own alpha?" "Because we have proof," I said, finding my voice. Documents in your own handwriting, detailing locations and vulnerable populations. Correspondence with the Silver Covenant outlining the terms of your agreement. Everything Demon said is true, and you know it. For a moment, I thought Tobias might try to bluff his way through. Then I saw calculation replace rage in his expression, and I knew he'd made a different choice. Kill them, he ordered his inner circle. All of them. The rogues, the Omega, even the old man if he's fool enough to stand with traitors. The world exploded into violence. Demon's pack moved with coordinated precision, protecting me and Mr. Chen while engaging Tobias's warriors, but they were outnumbered, and I could see the tide turning against them. Garrett went down under 3 attackers. Demon was bleeding from a dozen wounds, still fighting, but slowing. This was my fault. These people were dying because I dared to imagine I could matter, could make a difference. The old familiar shame rose up, telling me to submit, to accept that this was always how it would end for someone like me. Then I saw Elias stumble from the pack house, clutching his ribs, silver burns marking his skin where Tobias had struck him with some forbidden weapon. He'd fought for me. Demon was bleeding for me. Even Mr. Chen, fragile and elderly, stood his ground because he believed I was worth defending. I thought of my mother, who'd died giving me life, who'd chosen me over safety. I thought of every invisible person in Greystone who'd been discarded and forgotten, and I realized that shame was just another cage, another way of keeping people like us small and silent. I was done being small. The whistle was still around my neck. I brought it to my lips and blew, not the coded signals Demon had taught me, but one long, continuous note that seemed to pierce the very air. It wasn't a call to his pack. It was something deeper, more primal, a summons that reached beyond the immediate fight to touch something ancient in the forest itself. The trees responded. I'd heard stories, dismissed as myth, about the oldest parts of the forest holding power that predated packs and hierarchies, about spirits that answered to pain and injustice, that protected those who had no other protection. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wild things and growing earth. Branches creaked and groaned, and suddenly the forest floor itself seemed to writhe. Roots burst from the ground, thick as my arm, tangling around Tobias's warriors. Vines descended from trees, binding and restraining. The pack house groaned, its foundation, built partially into the hillside, shifting as ancient roots reclaimed what had been taken. It wasn't violent. Not exactly. It was simply the forest saying, enough. In the shocked stillness that followed, Sienna emerged from the tree line with a contingent of official-looking wolves, regional council enforcers, their authority marked by silver badges. By order of the council, their leader announced, Alpha Tobias Crane is to be detained pending investigation into charges of conspiracy with known human extremist groups and willful endangerment of pack members. The fight drained out of Tobias's supporters. They were warriors, yes, but even they wouldn't dare oppose the council. Tobias himself stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed empire crumble. When the enforcers moved to restrain him, he didn't resist, but his eyes found mine across the chaos. You're still nothing, he hissed. An Omega who got lucky. This doesn't change what you are. Demon was there before I could respond, battered and bleeding but unbowed. She's the woman who saved my pack member when no one else would. She's the one who uncovered your treason when everyone else looked away. She's the Omega who had more courage than you've ever possessed. His arm came around my shoulders, claiming and protective, and she's under my protection for as long as she wants it. Challenge that if you dare. Tobias didn't dare. None of them did. The next hours passed in a blur of statements and documentation, of council enforcers methodically cataloging Tobias's crimes. They found more evidence in his office. Details of hunter movements, payment records, damning correspondence. The truth was undeniable, and with it came the unraveling of Greystone's leadership. The elderly wolves from their isolated settlement were brought to the community center, along with the children from the church shelter. Demon's pack helped coordinate their protection, showing a gentleness that seemed at odds with their fierce reputation. I watched Sienna distribute blankets and food, watched Marcus tell stories to frighten children, and understood that this was what a real pack looked like. It was late afternoon when Demon found me sitting on the steps of the community center, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline. He lowered himself beside me with a wince, his wounds already healing but still tender. The council is installing a temporary alpha until Greystone can hold proper elections, he said quietly. Someone with no ties to Tobias's inner circle. He paused. They've also officially recognized Northwood's assistance and issued a formal apology for Crane's actions. That's good. I leaned against his shoulder, too tired to maintain propriety. Your pack, they were incredible today. Thank you. For everything, Elena. He turned to face me, his hand finding mine. I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before answering. He took a deep breath. Come back to Northwood with me, not as a refugee or a protected person, but as my mate. If you want that. I know we've only known each other days, and I know this is fast, but I kissed him. It was clumsy and desperate and perfect, cutting off his rambling explanation with the answer I'd been too afraid to voice. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, his expression held wonder and hope, and something that looked like love. Yes, I whispered against his lips. Yes to Northwood. Yes to you. Yes to everything. His answering smile was brilliant, transforming his face from hardened warrior to something young and joyful. I promise you, he said fiercely. I will spend every day proving you made the right choice. You'll never be invisible again, never be dismissed or discarded. In Northwood, you'll be valued for exactly who you are. I already am, I said, because it was true. He'd seen me from the beginning, had recognized something in me that I'd barely recognized in myself. Mr. Chen found us like that, wrapped around each other on the steps, and his smile was knowing and approving. So you'll be leaving us, he said, no question in his voice. Come with me, I offered immediately. Demon's pack has healers, resources. You wouldn't have to... Child, I'm too old to start over in a new place. His hand rested on my head, blessing and farewell. But I'll rest easier knowing you found where you belong. Go. Build the life your mother would have wanted for you. 3 days later, I stood at the border of Northwood territory, my few possessions packed in a borrowed bag. The journey had been long, but not lonely. Demon's entire pack had made the trip, protecting and guiding, treating me as one of their own before I'd even crossed into their land. The territory was beautiful, all rolling hills and dense forest, with a village that looked lived in and loved rather than merely occupied. Wolves of all designations moved freely, children playing without fear, elderly wolves sitting in places of honor. It was everything Greystone had failed to be. Welcome home, Demon said softly, his hand finding mine, and as we walked together into Northwood, into a future neither of us had dared imagine when a rejected Omega gave a stranger her last coins, I finally understood what my mother had meant about compassion. It didn't cost me everything. It had given me everything. A pack, a purpose, a love that saw my worth when the world insisted I had none. I was no longer invisible, no longer alone, no longer defined by what I lacked, but celebrated for what I carried. The courage to be kind when cruelty was easier, the strength to stand when falling was expected, the audacity to believe I deserved more than survival. 2 months later, Demon and I stood before the Northwood pack as he formally claimed me as his mate, and I claimed him in return. The bond settled over us like starlight, connecting us in ways that transcended words. And when the pack howled their approval, I joined them, my voice finally finding its place in the chorus, no longer a lone note crying into darkness, but part of a harmony that welcomed all its parts. The woman who'd once been invisible had become impossible to ignore. The Omega who'd been rejected had found acceptance beyond her wildest dreams. And the girl who'd given her last coins to a stranger had received a future richer than gold. Some endings are really beginnings. Some weaknesses are actually strengths. And sometimes 5 black wolves surrounding your house isn't a threat. It's a promise that you'll never face the darkness alone again.